You check your account on a random Tuesday. Nothing special happened that day. No bonus, no windfall, just a normal paycheck landing on top of what was already there. And the number reads $10,000. You stare at it a second longer than you need to. It doesn't feel real yet, but it is. For years, your bank balance was something you avoided looking at. Now it's something you keep checking just to make sure it's still true. What actually changed the moment that number appeared? It isn't the money itself. $10,000 doesn't buy a house. It doesn't replace a salary. In most cities, it wouldn't even cover a year of rent. So why does crossing this specific line feel like stepping into a different version of your life? Part of it is simple round number psychology. $9,900 and $10,100 are functionally the same amount of security, but your brain doesn't file them the same way. Round, clean thresholds act like mental finish lines. They're easier to remember, easier to celebrate, and easier to use as proof that the plan is working. That's not a flaw in your thinking. It's a shortcut your brain uses on purpose, and this channel's favorite kind of shortcut to expose, because once you see it, you can use it instead of being used by it. The answer starts with a number most people never even reach. Every year, the Federal Reserve publishes its report on the economic well-being of U.S. households, and one statistic from it keeps resurfacing. Roughly 1 in 3 adults would struggle to cover an unexpected $400 expense using cash or its equivalent, not a used car, not a medical bill. $400, a blown tire, a cracked phone screen, a dentist appointment that turns into a root canal. $10,000 isn't just 25 times that number. It's the difference between an emergency being a crisis and an emergency being an inconvenience. That's the first thing that changes, not your net worth, your relationship to bad news. Economists Sendil Mullainathan and Elder Shafir spent years studying what happens to decision-making when resources run low. Their research, published in the book Scarcity, Why Having Too Little Means So Much, found something counterintuitive. Scarcity doesn't just limit your options. It taxes your attention. People juggling tight finances weren't making worse decisions because they were less capable. They were making worse decisions because a chronic shortage of money was quietly consuming the mental bandwidth they needed for everything else. Work, parenting, sleep, judgment. That tax doesn't disappear at $10,000, but it drops sharply, because for the first time your brain isn't running a constant background calculation of what happens if something goes wrong this week. Here's where it gets more specific. Researchers at the J.P. Morgan Chase Institute studied millions of anonymized checking and savings accounts to answer a simple question: how much of a cash buffer does a household actually need to absorb a normal income shock, like a slow month of freelance work or a temporary layoff? Their findings pointed to a buffer in the range of roughly 1 to 3 months of take-home income for most households to weather typical volatility without falling into debt. For a lot of people, $10,000 sits right inside that range, not because it's a magic number, because it happens to be the point where your savings can actually function as a buffer instead of a rounding error. Financial author Dave Ramsey built an entire framework around this same idea, long before the research caught up to it. His widely followed step-by-step plan starts with a small starter emergency fund of around $1,000, just enough to survive the smallest shocks, before moving on to debt and bigger goals. $10,000 isn't the starter fund, it's several steps past it. For a typical household spending somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 a month, $10,000 edges close to the classic advice you've probably heard from every financial planner at some point: keep 3 to 6 months of essential expenses somewhere safe and liquid. You may not be all the way there yet, but you're no longer starting from nothing, and that distinction matters more than the exact math. So let's walk through what that actually looks like in a normal week. Your car needs a new transmission, $1,800. At zero savings, this is a 5-alarm event. You're calling family. You're opening a credit card with an interest rate you don't want to think about. You're rearranging next month's rent around a repair bill that showed up uninvited. At $10,000, the same repair is still annoying. It's still money you'd rather keep. But it doesn't rearrange your life. You pay it, you watch the number drop, and 3 weeks later it's already climbing back. The event doesn't become invisible. It just stops being dangerous. That shift, from dangerous to merely annoying, is the entire psychological weight of this milestone. Now picture a different kind of shock. Not a single bill, but a gap. You lose a client, or you get laid off, or your hours get cut, and for 2 months your income drops by half. At zero savings, this is the scenario that ends with missed rent, a maxed out card, or a call to family you didn't want to make. At $10,000, the same 2-month gap is survivable. Uncomfortable, still stressful, but survivable. You keep paying the essentials while you look for the next opportunity, instead of making decisions out of pure panic. That's the real function of this number, not luxury, runway. But here's the twist almost nobody talks about, and it's the reason so many people who finally hit $10,000 end up right back at $3,000 within a year. Behavioral economist Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on how people actually behave with money rather than how classic economic models assume they should, described a pattern called mental accounting. People don't treat every dollar the same. They mentally sort money into separate buckets: bill money, fun money, savings, and once a bucket crosses a threshold that feels comfortable, they start treating the surplus differently, looser, more spendable. Hitting $10,000 often triggers exactly this. The account that once felt fragile now feels padded. And a padded account, ironically, is when people start booking the trip they'd been postponing, upgrading the car they didn't need to upgrade, or moving money into a speculative investment, because the number finally feels big enough to do something with. None of that is automatically wrong, but it explains why the milestone itself doesn't lock in the progress. Crossing $10,000 proves you can follow a system long enough to get here. It doesn't yet prove you'll keep following it once the pressure that built the habit disappears. This is the part worth sitting with. The danger was never staying broke forever. Most people who reach this point didn't get here by accident. They built a small, boring, repeatable habit and stuck with it past the point where it stopped feeling exciting. The real risk shows up right after, in the 6 months where the account finally looks safe enough to raid. Think about what $10,000 represents in the story you've been telling yourself. Maybe it's proof you're not as bad with money as you feared. Maybe it's the first time in years you've fallen asleep without doing math in your head. Maybe it's just quiet, the kind of quiet that used to come from spending, now coming from not having to. Whatever it means to you, the number itself was never the finish line. It was the first checkpoint that proves the system underneath it works. The habit that got you from 0 to 10,000 is the same habit that gets you from 10,000 to 50. Nothing about the mechanism changes. What changes is how loud the anxiety used to be, and how quiet it's about to get if you let the same boring process keep running. If you're still below this line, the lesson isn't to feel behind. It's that the gap between 0 and 10,000 is the hardest stretch you'll ever cross, precisely because it's the only stretch with no buffer underneath you. Every dollar you save down there is doing double duty, building the fund and rebuilding your tolerance for risk at the same time. If you've already crossed it, the lesson is different. Watch what you do in the next few months more closely than you watched what got you here, because the mental accounting shift is quiet, and it's already started. You check your account again, days later, out of habit more than worry now. The number is still there, and for the first time in a long time, it doesn't scare you back.